Hey everyone! Tonight we're trading quiet dinners for couches, chaos, and the lingering scent of fermented fish sauce. Forget candlelit meals and polite conversation. A Roman banquet was a full-contact social sport, equal parts dinner party, political trap, and endurance test for your dignity. Imagine reclining awkwardly on your side trying to eat oysters while a drunken poet recites verses about your bald spot. Slaves rush by with platters of peacock tongues. Someone's vomiting loudly behind a curtain, and your host just announced a surprise philosophical debate during dessert. You wouldn't last an hour, let alone the whole night. Between the stomach-turning delicacies, forced laughter, and sudden accusations over wine, you'd be crawling toward the exit before the roasted dormice hit the table. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, let your mind wander, and allow the gentle rhythm of my voice to lull you towards sleep. Maybe settle in, pull your blanket a little closer, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we enter a world where candles flicker nervously in stone corridors, where whispers carry more weight than facts, and where being wrong, theologically, might earn you a charming little robe and an extended stay in the basement. Welcome to the Spanish Inquisition, a place where subtle social cues and slightly mispronounced Latin could get you tortured politely in God's name. Let's begin with how ridiculously easy it was to be accused. You didn't need to declare open rebellion, publish blasphemy, or lead a heretical cult. You just needed to be unlucky. Maybe you owned a book with Arabic script on the spine. Maybe you skipped church one too many Sundays. Maybe your neighbour thought your lentil stew smelled a bit too Jewish. You could be a tailor, a farmer, even a priest. Didn't matter. If someone whispered that your faith was unusual, and that whisper reached the ears of the Holy Office, your life was about to become significantly more beige, bureaucratic, and damp. The Inquisition was not a mob with pitchforks. It was worse. It was paperwork. Endless, soul-eroding paperwork. Officially, it existed to protect the purity of the Catholic faith. Unofficially, it operated like a sanctified HR department with the power to ruin your entire existence based on anonymous feedback. No defense lawyer, no right to face your accuser, just you, your confused conscience, and an inquisitor who hadn't smiled since the Reconquista. And let's talk about the inquisitors for a moment. These were not wild-eyed zealots foaming at the mouth. They were educated, meticulous, and deeply invested in administrative process. The worst kind of villain, the one who uses index cards. They had flowcharts, hierarchies of sin, cross-reference sin registers. Did you question transubstantiation? That's heresy type 3B. Did you fail to burn your old Quran after conversion? That's 2C. Did you dream about dancing? Suspicious. They called it auto da fe, act of faith. But for the accused, it felt more like an act of confusion. You'd be summoned, not told what you're being accused of, and invited to confess broadly. If you said, "I don't know what I'm confessing to," they'd nod wisely and note that you were in denial, which was also suspicious. And remember, the goal wasn't justice, the goal was repentance. Which sounds noble, until you realise that repentance was often measured in how convincingly you could cry while wearing a funny hat in public. Those hats, San Benitos, were masterpieces of humiliation. Imagine walking through your hometown, wearing a yellow tunic decorated with painted flames and grinning devils, This was medieval PR. You were both spectacle and cautionary tale. It wasn't enough to punish you. You had to help advertise the consequences. But maybe you weren't sentenced to public shame. Maybe they were more concerned about your soul. Then came the interrogations. And here's the thing. Officially, the Inquisition didn't torture. They examined with intensity, which in practice meant they just didn't call it torture. The strapado? That wasn't torture. It was vertical meditation. The rack? Postural adjustment. The toca? Just aggressive hydration. The best part. These techniques were often used not to extract confessions, but to confirm sincerity. Already confessed. Great. Now let's verify that with some waterboarding, just in case you're lying about lying. All of this was conducted with remarkable order. You'd be strapped down on a clean table next to a stack of carefully labelled theological treatises, in a room designed more like a library than a dungeon. Pain was sanitised, institutionalised, and yet through all this precision chaos lurked. You didn't know who accused you. You didn't know what would happen next. Your friends avoided you like plague. Your property might already be confiscated, pending investigation. You were guilty by suspicion, and innocent only through theatrically sincere submission. And if, heaven forbid, you claimed innocence and stuck to it, that just confirmed you were stubborn, possibly possessed, definitely in need of correction. The system rewarded obedience, not truth. This wasn't a trial. It was a spiritual performance review with stakes that included eternal damnation and public nudity. But perhaps most chilling of all, sometimes they let you go, just like that. No apology, no explanation. Just a vague warning and a stain on your social life that never quite washed out. And then, of course, they'd keep your name on a list in case you ever slipped again. So let's say you did confess. Maybe not to the exact thing they wanted, but something vaguely spiritual sounding. Like, yes, I did once question whether the bread in Mass actually becomes flesh. It was late, I was tired, the wine was stronger than expected. You'd think that kind of honesty might earn you a nod of compassion. Instead, you'd get more questions, follow-ups, footnotes. Interesting. And did you share this doubt with others? Did they nod? How often do you speak with your cousin Juan, who owns an Arabic dictionary? Congratulations. Your attempt at repentance just turned into a group indictment. You see, the Inquisition had range. You weren't just confessing your own sins. You were confessing your associations, your friendships, your conversations from 3 years ago. That weird thing you said at your cousin's wedding when the fish was bad, and heaven help you if you hesitated. Silence was interpreted as resistance. Resistance was a form of pride. And pride was, you guessed it, another heresy. Many confessions weren't voluntary at all. They were strategic. People confessed to one mild offence to avoid being accused of a bigger one. It was the theological version of plea bargaining, except the prosecutor had God on speed dial. And even if you said nothing heretical, your lifestyle might betray you. Too clean, suspicious, too well read, dangerous, too quiet, hiding something, too enthusiastic at Mass, overcompensating. You could be a monk and still be a suspect if your eyebrows twitched during the wrong psalm. One inquisitor even noted a case of excessive blinking during the liturgy as a red flag, and if you happened to be a converso, a Jew or Muslim who had officially converted to Christianity, then buckle up. You were already on thin theological ice, and people were waiting to see if you slipped. Let's pause and talk about conversos. because their lives were like walking through a spiritual minefield blindfolded backwards and carrying bread. You had to prove constantly that your conversion was sincere. That meant eating pork publicly, avoiding all Arabic phrases, laughing at Jewish jokes, the ones about you, and never ever closing your shutters on Saturdays, because apparently that meant you were observing the Sabbath. Some people changed their names, their accents, even their family recipes, just to avoid suspicion, and still they were targeted disproportionately. The Inquisition kept secret purity of blood records that traced lineage back generations. If someone whispered that your grandmother once lit a candle on a Friday night, boom, suspicion, interrogation, seizure of assets. But this wasn't just about belief, it was about control. The Inquisition wasn't policing your soul, it was policing your behaviour, your habits, your very identity. They weren't saving you from hell. They were making sure you never thought about hell incorrectly in the first place. Now let's talk about trial proceedings, or what passed for them. The inquisitorial process was like an escape room designed by medieval accountants. There were rules, yes, so many rules, but they mostly served to confuse and entrap. You might be asked to recite a catechism backwards, or explain the Eucharist using metaphor approved by Thomas Aquinas and no one else. Fail the quiz? Heretic. Pass it too confidently. Heretic with suspicious enthusiasm. Witnesses were anonymous. Testimonies could be decades old. You never saw the documents. You were in every sense on trial in the dark, and you didn't get a sentence immediately. You waited. Days, weeks, sometimes months, in a cell, in silence, with only bread, water, and the sounds of someone else getting encouraged 2 doors down. Your interrogators would visit you unpredictably, with new questions or updated charges, always delivered with politeness so chilling it made you miss open hostility. They'd ask about your dreams, your handwriting, your preference for almond milk. One man was accused of heresy because he said he didn't believe saints had visible halos. He claimed he was just being literal. They said he was being blasphemous. And if you happen to be a woman, oh well, double the scrutiny, half the logic. Women were often accused of heresy via the route of witchcraft. Did you make herbal tea? Suspicious. Did you cure your neighbour's rash with garlic? Dangerous. Did you read scripture and ask a question about it? Absolutely unacceptable. One woman in Seville was brought in for possessing an unusual smile during communion, another for whispering during a thunderstorm. The logic was, if God is speaking, why are you talking? Meanwhile, your possessions might be under investigation too. Books were burned, letters confiscated, even jewellery could be suspect, especially if it had unusual symbols or worse, came from Granada. The Inquisition was like a theological vacuum cleaner. It sucked up anything that wasn't nailed down and declared it suspicious. And yet, for all this madness, it worked, in the sense that people obeyed. They conformed. They bowed, scraped, wept, and confessed. Because the alternative wasn't just pain, it was social death, exclusion, shame, permanent spiritual suspicion. You didn't just want to survive the Inquisition, you wanted to be forgotten by it. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that you navigated this theological obstacle course without collapsing. You managed to confess, just enough to sound penitent. Not so much that they thought you were a practiced liar. You recited the prayers, you endured the examinations, you even survived the waterboarding with only a minor lifelong phobia of basins. Now comes the auto da fe, the grand finale of your Inquisition journey, And by grand, we mean deeply unsettling. An auto da fe, or act of faith, was not a private affair. It was a public event, a festival of fear wrapped in incense and organ music. Held in plazas or cathedrals, these spectacles were equal parts religious pageantry and social theatre. Think Sunday Mass meets medieval reality TV. You'd be marched out with the other accused, each of you clad in your sanbenitos, embroidered tunics designed to broadcast your sins like a walking billboard of moral failure. People would cheer, jeer, and quietly wonder whether they'd ever said anything questionable in front of you. The clergy gave sermons, the choir sang hymns. A list of crimes was read aloud with solemn authority, and you stood there, barefoot, trying to remember if you were supposed to look remorseful or just modestly bewildered. And then came sentencing. If you were lucky, your punishment might be fasting, exile, or a forced pilgrimage, preferably barefoot and uphill both ways. More commonly, you'd be imprisoned for an indefinite period in a cell, with no bedding, a curious draught, and the sound of your cellmate composing heretical poetry in the dark. But let's say you weren't lucky. Let's say they found your soul was too resistant, your thoughts too spicy, your dreams too vivid. Then the church would hand you over to secular authorities with hope for mercy, which was the 15th century version of a legal shrug. What happened next was technically not their problem. Spoiler, it often involved fire. Execution by burning was symbolic. The flames, they said, purified the soul. In reality, it was the most dramatic way to say, don't be weird around scripture. But even then, the process was controlled. You might be strangled first, a courtesy for those who cooperated. Others, not so much. And the audience? They came prepared. These events were social gatherings like football matches, but with more incense and fewer snacks. And all of it was recorded. The Inquisition kept meticulous records, many of which survive today. Your name, your confession, your sentence. Sometimes even notes like wept appropriately or refused to renounce cheese. Yes, cheese. One man in Toledo was accused of obstinately defending the superiority of goat cheese over sheep's, which was later interpreted as a veiled critique of Christ shepherd metaphors. Theological logic was stretchy, but conveniently so. Yet, perhaps most unsettling was how permanent it all was. Once accused, you were marked. Even if you were released, your name remained in the files. Your children might be scrutinized. Your grandchildren might be barred from certain professions. You were part of the inquisitorial family album now, a cautionary tale for future generations. And what about repentance? The church claimed that repentance was the goal, not punishment. But it was repentance defined by total surrender, to authority, to dogma, to the idea that your mind wasn't yours to wander. To repent meant to forget how to think in metaphor, to forget how to doubt. Because heresy wasn't a disease. It was a way of reading, a way of questioning, a way of interpreting the silence between verses. And in the world of the Inquisition, silence had only one meaning: obedience. Some learned to play the game. They wrote pious letters, donated to the church, and burned books preemptively. Some ran, across borders, across oceans. Some started new lives under new names. But the shadow followed. It wasn't just the institutions. It was the culture that the Inquisition cemented. A world where belief was policed, imagination was suspect, and laughter at the wrong moment could cost you everything. Even after the Inquisition formally ended, the stain remained. In laws, in libraries, in whispered caution. Entire generations grew up learning not how to think, but how not to be noticed. And still, heretics persisted. Not because they wanted to cause trouble, but because some ideas about freedom, about dignity, about how many candles it really takes to speak to God, just don't go away, even if you torture them a little. Let's take a moment to meet the post-Inquisition you. You survived, not triumphantly, more like limping spiritually, socially, and possibly literally. Your name had been cleared, sort of. You were back in town, technically free, but nothing was the same. People greeted you with an uncomfortable nod. The baker who once slipped you free rolls now avoided eye contact. Your priest smiled at you with all the warmth of a man legally required to do so, and you couldn't get work. Not decent work, at least. Who hires a former heretic to keep books, or teach children, or sell fabric without worrying that the textiles might carry unholy threads? Worse still, you were obliged to attend Mass more often than anyone else. Your repentance was meant to be visible, routine, humble. You sat in the front pew where everyone could watch you not blink too much during the homily. And if someone else in your family got accused, oh, that was a pattern, a tendency, an unfortunate spiritual trend. You might find yourself back in the Holy Office, not as the accused, but as a concerned relative being asked to clarify your cousin's beliefs on transubstantiation and whether or not he eats duck. And even if you died peacefully one day, your troubles might not end. Because yes, the Inquisition sometimes exhumed the dead. If it was discovered posthumously that you had written something inappropriate or owned forbidden literature, they'd dig you up, burn your bones, and convict your memory. A sort of theological zombie trial where your skeleton still lost the logic. If your bones weren't cleared, then your descendants were tainted. Purity was retroactive, which meant that your grandchildren might be refused baptism unless they disavowed you personally, which is hard to do when you're a toddler. Let's not forget the real heretics, the writers, scholars, and thinkers who dared to ask questions in public. Some had followers, some had theories about the universe, about grace, about the inner workings of the human soul. Some were just poets who got too metaphorical near a church. They weren't always tortured or burned. Some were silenced more efficiently by erasure, their works destroyed, their names omitted, their ideas assigned to anonymous or false doctrine. Whole movements collapsed under the weight of inquisitorial silence, and yet, somehow fragments survived, smuggled texts, secret discussions, a comment in the margin of a banned book, a gesture passed down like a whispered joke. The Inquisition may have dominated the courtroom, the pulpit, and the paper trail, but it never fully owned the kitchen table, the alley conversation, the lullaby. Let's be clear, the Spanish Inquisition wasn't all whips and fires. It was bureaucracy, at its most pious and pathological. It was suspicion weaponized, faith quantified, fear notarized. And for many the worst part wasn't even the punishment. It was the waiting, the slow erosion of certainty, the knowledge that your neighbour's glance could mean nothing, or everything, that you might wake up devout and fall asleep condemned, that no one, no matter how ordinary, was beyond reach. Even saints had bad days, but heretics, they didn't get days off. In the end, being a heretic during the Spanish Inquisition meant living with the knowledge that thought was a risk, that questions had weight, and that laughter, if timed poorly, might follow you to the grave. And even then, the Holy Office might still file a report. The wind across the steppe is sharp enough to slice thoughts in half. Dust and frost cling to your eyebrows, your throat tastes like road, and your horse, bless it, is one wobble away from giving up on life entirely. But just when your legs go numb and your vision starts to blur from exhaustion, a shape emerges on the horizon, squat, square, and utterly glorious. A Mongol postal relay station, civilization, Mongol style. To modern eyes it looks like a barn married a fortress. To you it looks like salvation. You dismount, or rather slide off your saddle in an undignified sprawl, and the station keeper is already there, lifting you to your feet before asking your name. No one greets you with flowers. They greet you with questions. Where are you coming from? What badge do you carry? What's your message? And how soon must it be delivered? Your answers had better be fast and truthful, because Mongol postal workers don't deal in patience. They deal in horses, distance, and imperial expectations. This, after all, is the engine that made the Mongol Empire possible. While history remembers the horsemen, the battles, and the conquests, it often forgets the bureaucracy. The Mongol postal system was a logistical miracle disguised as a pile of hooves and dust. At its peak, it connected cities thousands of kilometres apart with a speed and reliability that made European kings weep into their parchment. And it all hinged on the relay stations, Heretics, spaced roughly a day's ride apart, about 25 to 30 miles. These were the imperial nerve points, where couriers could swap exhausted horses for fresh ones, pick up supplies, and sometimes, if they were lucky, collapse into a blanket for 5 minutes before the next leg of their journey. Each station was manned by a team: handlers, cooks, scribes, grooms, guards, and one sleep-deprived commander who had probably memorized the face of every courier in the Empire. The job wasn't glamorous. It involved a lot of manure, bad tea, and suspiciously creative bandit deterrence. But it was essential. Every messenger arrived carrying a paisa, a metal tablet stamped with the authority of the Khan himself. The higher your rank, the fancier your plaque. Some were plain iron, some were silver inlaid with gold. A top-level paisa could get you anything: fresh horses, food, lodging, even commandeered labour if needed. But abuse it, and the consequences were swift. Imperial mail was sacred. Mongol rulers didn't joke about timeliness. A delay in delivering orders could mean an army starving, a city rebelling, or a peace treaty collapsing. So when a courier thundered into a station, everyone snapped to attention. You might think it was a mess. Horses snorting, papers flying, everyone shouting. But it wasn't. It was coordinated chaos, like a symphony made entirely of hooves and swearing. The station had supplies ready: oats, clean bridles, backup saddles, maps, boiled mutton, and of course fermented mare's milk, arrog. Slightly alcoholic, utterly necessary and always lukewarm. Messengers drank it by the bowl like life depended on it, because it did. The terrain varied. One day you might ride through snowdrift that clawed at your boots like icy fingers. The next, sandstorms made your lungs feel like they'd inhaled a desert, and yet the mail moved, always, through war zones, through floods, through rumours of wolves and actual wolves. Messages were short, efficient, often sealed in leather pouches to protect against rain, spit, and curiosity. Some carried troop movements, others tax records. A few, heartbreakingly, were personal, from generals to their families, or from soldiers trying to send one last word before battle. Most couriers didn't read what they carried. They didn't want to know. Knowing meant responsibility. Responsibility meant risk. But some couldn't help themselves. There are stories, half true, half legend, of a courier who read a love letter out loud in the dark to stave off loneliness, or another who memorized a military order so well He recited it even after losing the scroll to a river. The relay system worked like arteries. Each error was a heartbeat. If one failed, the whole thing could clog. And so, station masters were held to account. If a horse was sick, it had to be reported. If a courier was late, it had to be logged. If a seal was broken, someone was getting interrogated by a very stern man with a Mongol moustache and too much free time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was brilliant. And it moved empires. So you've made it to the station, chugged a cup of airag that tastes like bubbly barn, and swapped your sweat-drenched mount for a fresh, wide-eyed replacement that clearly resents you already. There's no time for sentiment. You're already back in the saddle, heading east toward another line of the map that might be a dot, a dream, or another muddy outpost. The Mongol relay system didn't just connect cities, it created them. Outposts sprang up along the Yam, the name for the network itself. Some became trade hubs, others remained humble staging points. All became nodes in a giant web stretching from Korea to the Caspian Sea. It was the Silk Road's nervous system, keeping the body of empire twitching with news, orders and gossip. And there was gossip. The relay network didn't just carry official mail, it transmitted knowledge, some sanctioned, some less so. A rumour might start in Samarkand, gallop west in a courier's mouth, and land in Karakoram 3 days later, half true and twice as entertaining. Station masters, despite their dusty appearance and deeply tragic haircuts, were often fountains of information. They knew who had passed through, where they were going, and whether they looked suspiciously well fed. They could tell you if the northern pass was closed due to snow, bandits, or yet another argument between rival goat clans. They also served as first responders. When riders failed to arrive, it was the station master who sent a recovery team, or more often, a teenager with a spear and a prayer, to go looking. Sometimes the horses returned alone. Sometimes the satchel arrived via a wandering merchant who found it near a set of suspicious footprints. Security wasn't just about speed, it was about presence. Mongol rulers made it clear. Harming a messenger was treason against the empire itself. If you robbed, delayed, or even mildly inconvenienced a courier, the response wasn't polite diplomacy. It was a punitive raid with fire, arrows, and extremely pointed questions. And yet, many still tried, because messengers carried valuable things. Not just messages, but occasionally money, medicinal herbs, or rare gifts from one dignitary to another. Bandits saw an opportunity, but so did spies. Espionage was the flea on the dog of imperial logistics. Other empires tried to mimic the Mongol system or infiltrate it. There are records of rival agents disguising themselves as messengers, hoping to access sensitive documents or maps, which is why Paiza verification became ritualistic. Upon arrival, couriers had to present their badge, repeat a code phrase, and sometimes answer obscure questions. What is the name of the third son of Batu Khan? What colour scarf did the last courier wear? Are you limping because of wolves or because of treason? Messengers developed a gallows humour about it. One joked that the hardest part of the job wasn't the miles or the bandits. It was remembering which code phrase has been changed this week. Another swore that forgetting his saddle number almost got him killed by a 70-year-old postmaster with a butter knife. And then there was the weather. Always the weather. Rain-soaked scrolls, snow-blinded riders. Winds ripped letters from your belt and scattered them like divine confetti. Sandstorms turned your eyes into regret. Summer heat made your horse hallucinate. And still you rode. Some stations had tents. Others were built from packed mud, brick, or wood, depending on what the region offered, but all shared one quality: utility over comfort. Beds were straw, walls were thin, toilets were ambitious guesses at sanitation. But the tea was hot, the broth salty, and the horses always ready. Mail could not stop. The empire depended on it, and not just for war. Diplomats, merchants, scholars, they all used the yam. So did doctors, so did spies. The lines between personal and political, urgent and trivial, blurred on the backs of galloping ponies. A love letter might travel beside a battle order, a recipe beside a coded message, and yet each was treated with the same respect, or at least the same speed, because the yam wasn't just a postal service. It was a statement, a declaration that the empire knew where you were going, and how quickly it could reach you. And for a government based on movement, on overwhelming presence, that made all the difference. By now, your thighs no longer feel like part of your body. Your cloak is coated in a mixture of horse sweat, sand, and possibly fermented cabbage. You've passed 2 dead squirrels, 1 overturned cart, and a monk who may or may not have been sleepwalking across the plains. You're not sure what day it is, but you know you're still expected to shave 50 minutes off your previous run time. Welcome to Mongol logistics. You reach another Ertur just after nightfall. The place is buzzing, not loudly, but in that tightly wound, purposeful way that makes you feel like you're already behind. Another rider is eating while standing. A clerk is updating a route ledger by candlelight, and someone is yelling at a goat who has stolen an official seal. You hand off your badge, mutter your code word, and swap out your exhausted mount for one that looks suspiciously like its twin. Fresh oats are poured, saddles adjusted. No one speaks unless it's necessary. There's no drama here, no music, no speeches, just function. These stations ran like little military units, except instead of weapons, their ammunition was reliability. Each one had to be ready at all times for an imperial messenger to burst through the door with muddy boots and existential urgency. The Erturs also had to maintain up-to-date information. Which rivers were frozen? Which bridges washed out? Where were the bandits spotted last week? Maps were updated constantly. So were travel logs, courier identifications, horse feed ratios, and emergency supply levels. Some stations even tracked which saddles caused chafing. The Mongols didn't just conquer with horses, they conquered with admin. The brilliance of the system wasn't in speed alone. It was in resilience. If a station burned down, the next 2 would adjust. If a courier died, the next station standby would take the message forward. Every piece had backup. Every failure had a contingency. And the Khan's court knew all of it. Reports from the field were digested weekly, sometimes daily, and used to make decisions with near-instant reaction time. This was centuries before the telegraph. No satellites, no servers, just rugged men and tired horses carrying the collective pulse of an empire. And if you think they didn't have metrics, think again. Time logs were maintained, horse rotation was tracked, failure rates were analysed. If your station had too many delays, you got a warning. If it happened again, you were replaced, or reassigned to goat management in the Gobi. Some riders became legends, not generals, not kings, just men who once delivered a treaty across 2,000 kilometres in under 5 days, or who survived wolf attacks and snowstorms, arriving with broken ribs and the message still dry. One such courier, according to a half-credible source, refused to dismount when he arrived at the Khan's court. He delivered the scroll, nodded once, then passed out while still technically standing. He received a cup of mare's milk, a new pair of boots, and something rarely given, the Khan's personal acknowledgement. And yet, the system wasn't eternal. Over time, corruption crept in. Stations began to slow. Resources were diverted. Badges were forged. Some nobles demanded that the Yam carry their personal shopping lists. Others installed family members in station posts, where they napped instead of maintaining routes. The system bloated, and eventually, during the Empire's decline, the relay faded too, overtaken by fractured kingdoms, shifting borders, and the unfortunate truth that empires run better on discipline than nostalgia. But while it lived, it was glorious. Imagine an empire where a message could travel 1,000 miles in less time than it takes you to get a reply from your cousin about dinner plans. That was the Yam. Not magic, just an absurdly well-organised army of riders, grooms, clerks, horses, and the occasional grumpy goat. The night is quiet now. Your horse is asleep. Stand-in, of course. The station has dimmed to whispers. Somewhere, a pot of something vaguely edible simmers. You sit cross-legged on a fur mat, muscles twitching from the ride, and realise you've become part of something stranger than war, larger than conquest. You've become infrastructure. And in the Mongol Empire, that was a sacred role. The Urto system wasn't just a mail route, it was a living symbol of control, over land, over people, over information. It proved that no matter how far-flung the empire became, it could still communicate with itself. And in a world without instant messaging, that meant power. Genghis Khan knew that control over speed meant control over decision-making. It wasn't enough to conquer. You had to respond, coordinate, anticipate. The empire moved because the messages did. And the ones moving those messages, often overlooked. No parades, no epic songs, just calloused hands, ruined spines, and an uncanny ability to navigate by stars and horse droppings. Some couriers were barely out of adolescence. Others were veterans, trusted with diplomatic pouches wrapped in oilskin and guarded like gold. Some rode alone across enemy territory, armed with little more than a dagger and a really fast horse. Others died en route, from weather, wolves, or accidents, but still the mail moved. The system had its moments of absurdity too. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, possibly not, of a courier so devoted that he delivered a letter after dying. The horse arrived at the station with the man still upright in the saddle, frozen solid. The note, still sealed, still dry. The station log recorded it as a successful arrival with slight personnel malfunction. What's undeniable is that the relay system influenced others. Later empires copied the model. Europeans marvelled at it. Even centuries later, historians still gawk at the efficiency and wonder how something so robust could vanish. Because vanish it did. As the empire fractured, stations went unmanned. Horses were no longer replaced. Bandits returned to the roads, maps were lost, and the great arteries of communication dried up into veins of memory. But the legacy remained. The word yam still appears in some Central Asian languages to refer to postal systems. Ruins of Urtus still dot the landscape. Collapsed walls, charred beams, bones of horses who never made the next stretch. And in dusty archives from Venice to Persia, you'll find letters stamped with Mongol marks, carried by anonymous men who never signed their names but shaped the history they moved through. So the next time you complain about a delayed email or curse your phone for losing signal, remember that once there were riders who braved storms, starvation, and angry marmots to get a piece of parchment from one side of the world to another. No likes, no cloud storage, just grit, speed, and a saddle that smelled like history. That was the Mongol postal relay, and somehow it still echoes, quietly, in every line we draw between people and power. Welcome to Mohenjo-Daro. It's 2500 BCE, and you're standing barefoot on baked mud bricks, trying not to trip over a terracotta sewer cover. The sun is already sharp. There's a suspicious cow loitering near your well, and your neighbour just finished scrubbing his armpits in a private bathroom, inside his house. Yes, you heard that right. Private bathroom in the 3rd millennium BCE. Long before Rome dreamt of aqueducts or Paris discovered sidewalks, the people of Mohenjo-Daro had figured out something crucial. If you want your civilization to last, don't let everyone poop near the drinking water. This was not a city built for kings. It was a city built for function, wide streets, right angles, public wells, drainage systems that modern tourists still gawp at. You could drop a bucket of water in one part of town and trace its journey all the way to the river, unless it got hijacked by a thirsty goat. And hygiene wasn't just accidental, it was planned. Let's start with the drains. The city streets were lined with covered drainage channels, made from brick, sloped perfectly to allow waste to flow away from homes. These weren't random ditches, they were engineered. Some were even double layered. One level for rainwater, another for household waste. It was the Bronze Age version of please don't mix the bathwater with the dishwater, and each home had access to this system. Many houses had a small room, tiled with a sloped floor, used for washing. Wastewater would flow out through a chute that connected directly to the main drain. Your used bathwater could travel down the same channel as your neighbour's dirty dishwater, and both would be flushed out of the city before anyone had a chance to complain. The waste channels were covered with large slabs that could be lifted for cleaning, which meant someone had the job title of drain checker. Not glamorous, but probably essential. Because a blocked sewer in a 40°C summer, that's not just unpleasant, that's civilization ending. But Mohenjo-Daro didn't stop at waste. They thought about water sourcing too. There were over 700 wells, public and private, scattered throughout the city. Some homes had their own personal well in the courtyard, like a status symbol made of groundwater. Others shared larger neighbourhood wells, carefully built with inward-sloping bricks to prevent collapse. Water was everyone's business, and so were bathing practices. You didn't need a religious festival to wash. You just needed to not smell like the inside of a grain silo. That's not to say hygiene wasn't spiritual. It definitely had sacred connotations. Ritual purity existed, but it wasn't monopolized by priests. Everyday cleanliness seemed to be a civic and cultural norm. There's no record of signs saying, please wash your hands, but the architecture screamed it anyway. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Great Bath. Yes, the city had one. A massive public tank, waterproofed with brick and bitumen, complete with changing rooms, a drain system and stairs. It wasn't for swimming laps. It was for cleansing, both literal and symbolic. Archaeologists still argue over its exact purpose. Was it religious, social? Did it host ancient water aerobics classes? We don't know, but we do know it was maintained, cleaned, respected. And perhaps that's the key takeaway. Public hygiene wasn't an afterthought. It was embedded into daily life. Trash pits were located outside residential zones. Toilets were simple but efficient. A ceramic basin over a hole, often flushed with a bucket. In some cases, these even emptied into covered soak pits filled with charcoal and gravel. That's not just sanitation, that's waste management. And it was all done without rulers carving their names into everything. No giant statues, no royal proclamations on marble, just consistent anonymous cleanliness. And that might be the most remarkable thing of all, because while other ancient cities left behind monuments to ego, Mohenjo-Daro left behind plumbing. You wake up in your neatly rectangular brick house, stretch, and head straight for your private washing platform. Just a tiled corner with a drain, but it's yours. No waiting, no public fountain lines, and best of all, no awkward eye contact with strangers while lathering. You fill your clay jar at the courtyard well, splash the morning sleep off your face, and, without really thinking about it, let the water drain off into a brick chute that vanishes into the wall. The city takes care of the rest, because in Mohenjo-Daro the plumbing thinks ahead. Most ancient cities, if they had plumbing at all, funneled everything downhill and hoped for the best. But Mohenjo-Daro designed drainage into the city. Engineers placed the whole settlement on a grid, with wide streets running north-south and east-west. Houses were oriented not toward temples or kings, but toward function. That meant ventilation, daylight, and, crucially, water flow. Many drains emptied into larger main lines beneath the streets, and those ran to soak pits, settling tanks, or outflow points beyond the city. Stormwater didn't sit, grey water didn't puddle, and human waste, that was handled. There were no grand aqueducts like in Rome, no towering cisterns. Instead, the Indus people built for closeness. You didn't need a 10-mile pipeline when your well was 15 steps away, and your toilet drain was already being gently filtered through gravel. And this wasn't a feature of just elite homes. Even modest dwellings showed signs of access to water and waste removal. Some had internal drains made of brick, plastered for waterproofing. Others used terracotta pipes or covered trenches. The materials varied, but the idea remained. Water should be used, then removed. Archaeologists were stunned to find dozens of houses with private latrines. A small ceramic pot or brick basin, sometimes set above a sloped chute. The waste would drop into a covered drain or collection pit outside the wall, often lined with ash or charcoal, to reduce smell and encourage decomposition. Sound familiar? It's basically the Bronze Age version of a septic system, and again no signs shouted about it. No inscriptions boasted so-and-so built this drain. Cleanliness was not a monument, it was normal, which makes the Indus people deeply frustrating for traditional historians. There's no Rosetta Stone, no epic poem, no list of glorious kings, just seal impressions, pottery shards, and perfectly aligned sewage systems. What kind of people prioritise soapstone filters over stone thrones? Let's talk public spaces. The Great Bath gets all the attention, but the whole city functioned like a giant low-key spa. Wide roads allowed for waste removal carts, or more likely teams of workers who swept and maintained the public drains. Stepwells ensured access to water even during dry seasons. Drain junctions were fitted with inspection holes. Little square tiles you could lift to check for clogs or less pleasant discoveries. And even the Acropolis, the elevated part of the city which archaeologists once assumed was for the ruling elite, seems more like an administrative or ceremonial zone. It wasn't littered with golden goblets. It had grain storage, wells, and more bathing platforms. This suggests a ruling class more interested in governance than grandeur. A society obsessed not with conquest but maintenance. And don't be fooled by the lack of pyramids. This was advanced urban living. People had time to make jewellery, play board games and paint ceramics, because the toilets worked. Imagine your day. You wake. Washington. Eat lentils, go to market dodging goats and small children, chat near the public well, return home, use your latrine, sleep, unbothered by overflowing gutters or open sewage. It's not glamorous, it's not cinematic, but it's civilization, and it likely contributed to the city's longevity. Because in a world where cities often died of their own filth, where cholera, dysentery and parasites made ancient urban living feel like a bad survival challenge, Mohenjo-Daro persisted. Not because it had divine favour, but because it had terracotta drain pipes. Even the placement of kitchens, usually toward the rear of the home near the drain line, suggests conscious planning. Ashes were probably swept out into disposal pits. Organic waste could be composted. In some cases, houses seem to have been rebuilt around existing drains, maintaining alignment with older infrastructure. Let that sink in. They prioritised the plumbing before the walls. This wasn't accidental brilliance, it was a cultural mindset. Cleanliness, practicality, flow. And in a city that may have housed 30,000 to 40,000 people, that mindset wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary. It's afternoon in the city and the sun is punishing, but the streets remain tolerable. Not because of divine intervention, but because you're not walking through sludge. There is no trash lining the gutters, no brown puddles of unknown origin. Why? Because every drop of waste, from a washer's rinse basin to your neighbour's ill-timed lentil explosion, is channeled away by a brick and terracotta infrastructure that just works. This was Mohenjo-Daro's silent genius. Instead of building upwards, it built inwards, into the ground, into the habits of daily life, into the bones of the city itself. We don't know what the people called themselves. We don't know what gods they worshipped, or what language they spoke, but we know this. They believed in not stepping in it. Let's talk numbers. The city had roughly 700 wells, with many homes having private ones, an absurd number for an ancient urban centre. Each well was carefully constructed using wedge-shaped bricks, meticulously sloped for durability. These weren't slapdash holes in the dirt. They were engineered to last. Some still do. Access to clean water was clearly a right, not a luxury. And unlike many other ancient societies, there's no strong evidence of caste-like water segregation. No upper-class fountain versus filthy commoner's bucket. Just wells. Wells for everyone. That suggests a radically egalitarian approach to public hygiene. And this equality extended to city planning. The residential areas weren't haphazard slums next to elite compounds. They were organised, structured, clean. You could walk from a modest home to a public building without needing to skirt filth or cross garbage canals. This was urban dignity by design, and again, no king's name stamped on every brick. Just function, silently maintained. Let's look closer at the sanitation logic. Every household, no matter how small, was part of the drainage ecosystem. Waste flowed down chutes and narrow covered drains that merged with larger street drains. These, in turn, fed into central runoff paths that exited the city perimeter. Larger waste pits were likely emptied regularly, possibly by teams of municipal workers. Yes, garbage collectors. In 2500 BCE. Some archaeologists believe there may have been laws governing sanitation. Not engraved on stone slabs, nothing as dramatic, but enforced through community norms or local administration. After all, someone had to organise the construction. Someone had to set the standard height for street drains, or decide which walls got which soak pit. This was a city where the plan came first, And don't think the hygiene stopped at plumbing. Artifacts suggest cleanliness extended to body care too. Small terracotta jars may have held ointments or pastes. Stone discs and shell items could be combs or mirrors. There's evidence of tweezers, razors, and other grooming tools. In other words, these people had routines. You didn't just wash, you exfoliated. This doesn't mean Mohenjo-Daro was a utopia, but it was structured in a way that promoted public health, civic cooperation, and personal dignity, without religious dogma or monumental coercion. That's rare. Most ancient cities shouted about their greatness through temples, palaces, and blood-soaked statues. Mohenjo-Daro whispered it through level walkways and flush toilets. Even the construction materials point to intention. Bricks were standardized in size, a 4 to 2 to 1 ratio for length, width, and height, which made repairs easier. Plaster was used in key locations to waterproof areas like bath floors and containment chambers. Clay pipes weren't haphazardly laid. They followed slope logic, ensuring that gravity did the work. And it all required constant upkeep. That means civic labour. That means people got up in the morning and thought, better clean that sediment trap before it overflows into the neighbour's goat pen. These weren't just individuals. This was a community of maintenance, even in the city's final phases, as decline set in for reasons still debated. Climate change, tectonic shift, political collapse. The drainage kept working. Houses were rebuilt, pipes relaid. The system endured longer than the rulers. If you want a metaphor for civilizational resilience, skip the pyramids. Look at a working sewer from 4,000 years ago. It's still there, it still drains, and it still quietly says, we knew how to live together, cleanly. You're walking through the market. The air smells like cumin, baked clay, and just a hint of goat, but not rot, not sewage. There are no puddles of mystery, no piles of refuse attracting flies like worshippers to incense. Because in Mohenjo-Daro, waste was handled, not glorified, not spiritualized, just handled. That's what made this city different. It wasn't about displays of might, wealth, or divine favour. It was about functionality at a scale no other Bronze Age civilization even attempted. While others were erecting monuments, Mohenjo-Daro was quietly inventing urbanism. And it all came down to water. Moving it in, moving it out, keeping it clean, keeping it separate. The separation of clean and dirty water might seem obvious today, but in 2500 BCE, it was revolutionary. Mohenjo-Daro's layout enforced it, not with signs or police, but with bricks and gravity. Baths were always uphill from latrines. Drains angled out of houses, not into them. Soak pits were placed strategically, and runoff was routed away from wells. This wasn't ad hoc. It was design language written in terracotta and time. Even when buildings were repaired, care was taken to preserve drainage alignment. Plaster was reapplied, pipes were relaid. The city understood something we forget too often today. You cannot build a society faster than you can clean it. Let's talk failure. Because every system fails eventually, so what happened when the drains backed up? Or the soak pits filled too fast? Well, we don't know for sure, but excavation layers suggest maintenance was constant. Broken bricks were replaced, access points were left clear. There are signs of clogging, and signs it was addressed. Some pits were filled with ash or charcoal, probably to neutralize odour and accelerate decomposition. That's early biochemistry, performed without microscopes. Some theories even suggest waste layering, the purposeful stacking of organic waste for later use as compost. This implies not just civic duty, but civic literacy. People understood their systems, respected them, lived with them, because you can't fake good hygiene over centuries, not in a population of tens of thousands, not without religion making you do it, not without someone, likely everyone, taking part. And therein lies the marvel of Mohenjo-Daro. It wasn't just advanced, it was collaborative. No autocrat's face stares at you from the bricks. No battle scenes, no triumphal arches, just modular homes, community drains, and a collective agreement. Let's not live in our own mess. Even the toys, yes, there were toys, suggest a society that saw children not as labour units, but as people. Small carts, carved animals, game pieces. Who has time to whittle elephants unless the toilets are working? And when disaster came, be it earthquake, drought, or river shift, the city didn't burn in chaos. It faded. Orderly. With dignity. The buildings fell. The streets filled. But even then the drains remained intact longer than the roofs. And when archaeologists arrived, dusty and sunburned, 3 millennia later they didn't find treasure chambers or royal tombs. They found sewer lines, perfectly aligned, still sloping gently toward the edge of town. That's the legacy. Not conquest, not glory, but flow. So the next time someone talks about the greatest ancient civilizations, pause before you mention the pyramids or the Parthenon, and remember the people who didn't just build, they cleaned. So you imagine pirates dividing treasure like this. A heaping pile of gold. A parrot squawking numbers. Men with eye patches shouting, "Mine," and pointing cutlasses. Maybe someone cheating, someone bleeding, and someone swinging from the rigging for dramatic effect. And yes, that happened. Sometimes. But most of the time dividing pirate treasure was weirdly organised. Because if you're going to risk your life robbing armed ships while drunk, malnourished and questionably literate, you want to make very sure you get your cut. Preferably with a receipt. Which is why many pirate crews had something more surprising than cannons, a written contract. It was called the Articles of Agreement, pirate bylaws, signed, or at least thumbprinted by everyone aboard before the first ship was ever boarded, and these articles laid out exactly how treasure would be divided. Let's say your crew just took a Spanish galleon filled with silver, cocoa, and extremely confused friars. Once the smoke cleared and the hostages stopped crying, the loot would be inventoried, counted, measured, and, this is key, distributed according to the rules, not royal rules, not maritime law, pirate rules. Most articles followed a rough structure. The captain got 1.5 to 2 shares. The quartermaster, second in command, got 1.25 to 1.5 shares. Gunners, carpenters and navigators often received extra half shares for their skills. Regular crew got 1 full share. The cabin boy usually got half a share, unless he'd earned full rank by stabbing someone impressively. This wasn't generosity, it was survival math. Pirate life was high risk, short-term and heavy on dental abscesses. If you didn't feel fairly compensated, you might mutiny, jump ship, or accidentally shoot the quartermaster during a storm. So the system had to feel fair, or at least predictable, but fairness had limits. Injuries, for example, came with standard compensation. Lose an arm, you might get 600 pieces of 8. Lose a leg, 500. Lose an eye, 100. Lose your sanity. Sorry, that wasn't listed. These weren't symbolic gestures. They are insurance policies. Pirates created a crude social security system long before most nations did. partly out of necessity, partly because they were the ones handing each other pistols. The rules extended beyond gold. Booty often included cargo, weapons, clothes, liquor, tobacco, and luxuries like sugar or tea. All had to be divided, sometimes equally, sometimes auctioned off to the highest bidder among the crew, with proceeds going into a shared fund to be split later. Even prisoners were part of the economy. Captains might ransom them, sell them, or, in rare cases, adopt them as crew. If a prisoner had useful skills, navigator, surgeon, cook who could kill weevils with spices, they might be offered a spot. But once aboard, they got a say in loot shares. After all, pirates weren't sentimental, they were practical, and they loved votes. Unlike navy ships where the captain's word was law, pirate captains held power by consent. Crew could vote to remove them. Votes were also used to decide when to attack, where to sail, and how to deal with loot disputes. Which made the quartermaster crucial. He was the accountant, the disciplinarian, the mediator, and sometimes the one who kept the captain from doing something stupid just to look cool. When loot was tallied, the quartermaster ensured it was done in front of the crew. No locked cabins, no secret stashes. Because pirate justice was blunt. If you were caught cheating, you didn't get demoted. You got marooned, or shot, or tied to a barrel and floated out to think about your actions. And yet, despite the system, chaos found a way in. Sometimes a captain got greedy. Sometimes a crewman decided to help himself to an extra ruby or 4. Sometimes the loot itself was cursed, or just contained more onions than expected, leading to infighting and accusations of treachery. But even then, pirates turned to their rules, their articles, because they knew, without them they weren't a crew, just a bunch of violent freelancers in a leaky boat. So, you've just sacked a merchant ship, and now you're floating in international nowhere with crates of silver, barrels of rum, sacks of spices, and at least 3 things that are definitely alive and should not be. The adrenaline fades. The wounds are bandaged with rum. And now it's time to do the one thing pirates actually took more seriously than violence: division of spoils. Step 1, inventory everything. And yes, they actually did this. The quartermaster, not the captain, took the lead. He was responsible for counting, weighing, and recording everything pillaged. Because while the captain led the attack, the quartermaster led the economy. Want to know if a pirate ship was run like a business? Consider this. Some ships carried ledgers, not just for loot, but for rations, injuries, absences, and disciplinary actions. Blackbeard flogged Jenkins for sleeping through lookout duty. Rations reduced. Also, Jenkins is missing 3 teeth. Pirates kept track, not because they were virtuous, but because forgetting who got what led directly to fights, mutiny, and mid-ocean homicides. Step 2. Account for wounds. Injuries during battle earned compensation, a crude but effective disability payout system. Crew articles often listed specific amounts. Right arm, 600 pieces of 8. Left leg, 500. Right eye, 100. Fingers, negotiable. This wasn't just humane. It was incentive. If your crew knew they'd be rewarded for losing body parts, they'd fight harder. And if you didn't pay them fairly afterward, well, you might be the next body missing parts. Step 3. Deduct communal costs. Before splitting anything, the ship took its cut. This included repair materials, planks, pitch, nails, gunpowder and shot, food supplies, bribes, oh yes, as many ports ran on them, rum, tobacco and recreational reading. Okay, mostly rum. These expenses were logged and deducted from the total, and only then was the loot split by shares. And let's talk about those shares again, because pirate pay grades weren't equal, but they were consistent. A skilled carpenter might earn 1.25 shares. A talented gunner might get a bonus if he hit a particularly spicy cannon shot. Captains earned more, but never too much more, unless they wanted a knife in their hammock. Most captains earned 2 shares at most, a sign of status, yes, but also of the dangerous balance between authority and crew resentment. The real tension lay between the top ranks and the rank and file, because even with rules, people cheated. The temptation was always there, a few extra coins tucked in a boot, a ring accidentally left off the manifest, a barrel of cocoa requisitioned for morale. And when caught, the consequences were immediate. Some crews enforced equal punishment. If you stole from the crew decided your fate, which could mean anything from a fine to being tied to the mast in a storm, or, in one case, being forced to mop the deck with your shirt while wearing it. Step 4. Auction the weird stuff. Not all loot was easily divisible. Silks, spices, fine clothing, exotic pets. These were auctioned off internally. Crew members bid using their share of silver, and the proceeds were added to the communal pot. That way, no one ended up with half a monkey or a third of a peacock. Occasionally the weird stuff was saved for bartering in port, or gifted to allies, fence contacts, or governors looking the other way. Sometimes even letters were part of the haul, and yes, some pirates read them, especially if the letters contained trade secrets, diplomatic intel, or, in one delightful case, very detailed descriptions of someone's foot condition. That information was sometimes more valuable than gold. Because pirates weren't just robbers, they were strategists. They didn't raid randomly. They targeted specific ships on specific routes during specific times of year, often based on whispered intel from taverns, brothels, or disgruntled dock workers. Information, just like treasure, could be shared, or hoarded, or weaponized, and that made the quartermaster's job even more complicated, because in addition to being the loot master, he was also the arbiter of fairness. If 2 pirates argued over a ruby, the quartermaster decided. If someone complained about being shorted, the quartermaster investigated. If someone accused the quartermaster of cheating, well, that got awkward fast. In theory, disputes could go to a vote. But in practice, if you challenged the math, you'd better have math to back it up. Or friends. Or a plan to swim a very long way. And yet, for all its flaws, this system usually worked. Crews rarely mutinied over loot division, because they knew what they were getting. They agreed to it in writing. And in a world of constant danger, predictable reward was worth more than gold. Now let's be clear, pirates were not egalitarian saints. They weren't floating utopias of shared wealth and brotherly love. They were violent, opportunistic, and occasionally smelled like someone had tried to cook ham in their boots. But within that chaos, they did something remarkable. They practiced a kind of democracy. And that democracy had one sacred pillar: loot-sharing fairness. After every raid, after every storm, after every stint of being chased by navies, or accidentally anchoring next to a volcano, the crew expected one thing: transparency. This is why the quartermaster was often more important than the captain. The captain led in battle. The quartermaster led in everything else. He handled disputes, managed supplies, kept the books, and, perhaps most dangerously, stood between the crew and a chest of gold coins. He needed to be trusted more than liked, because if the crew suspected he'd pocketed even a coin, well, mutinies have started over less. Some articles had specific clauses about cheating. If any man be found to withhold or conceal any part of the plunder, he shall be marooned, or shot, or have his nose sliced most foul. And if that sounds excessive, remember, pirates didn't have courts. They had consensus and cutlasses. So how did they handle disputes? Usually through votes. Even punishment was often voted on. A man might plead his case in front of the crew. Accusers gave testimony. Witnesses shouted. The whole thing might end with a cheer, a jeer, or a surprisingly well-argued defence involving rum calculations. Pirates had no interest in kangaroo courts. They wanted justice they could see, and preferably one that didn't interrupt dinner. If the vote didn't resolve it, they had one final recourse, the duel. Yes, pirate duels were real, but often less dramatic than Hollywood shows. Two crewmen might fight with pistols, swords, or fists, usually in a semi-controlled environment. Rules varied. Sometimes it ended at first blood, sometimes it ended when one man stopped breathing, and sometimes it ended when someone shouted, "Forget it! Split the damn pearl and move on!" Because time was money, and arguing over who got the ruby-handled pistol might delay the more important business, drinking. Now about special loot. Some items defied fair division. A gold crucifix too valuable to auction, a gem-encrusted dagger with sentimental value, or a piece of cursed jewellery that no one wanted to touch but everyone wanted to argue about. In such cases, crews had a few options. Draw lots, literally pulling tokens from a hat. Silent bidding, each man wrote an amount and the highest took it. Mutual agreement, rare and suspicious. Captain's discretion, only if unanimously allowed. Sometimes such objects were kept in a common chest to be sold later. Proceeds were then split like usual once a fair market price was found, often at the next lawless port that didn't ask too many questions about bloodstains. Let's not forget, loot also came in non-monetary forms: maps, secrets, safe routes, even forged documents. Forgers were highly valued. If you could turn a Spanish customs slip into a legit merchant license, you were worth your weight in gold. That kind of loot was kept by the quartermaster to be used strategically. But the crew expected a cut of the benefits if it resulted in future plunder. This created a weird kind of shared intellectual property. Your fake seal helped us rob a frigate. We all eat better tonight. Which brings us to port towns, the true test of pirate fairness. Once docked, crews were at their most vulnerable. Gold in pocket, wine in reach, and every temptation imaginable crammed into 5 poorly lit streets. But even then, loot rules followed. Some ships had a spending pause. No one was allowed to spend their shares until after a cool-down period, a day or two to account for adjustments, fines, or emergencies. If someone blew their share immediately, too bad. There were no bailouts. Pirates didn't believe in second chances with money. You lost it, you lived with it. Or you went back to sea and earned it again. And if the crew was paid out before docking, the quartermaster might give only partial shares, holding the rest as security to avoid mass drunken arrests. It wasn't exactly a bank, but it worked. Finally, if a crew disbanded, or if the ship was lost and the survivors made it to port, the final split was sacred. What was recovered, carried, or hidden was to be brought forward. Anyone caught lying? Well, best not be caught. Because pirates could forgive many things, but not messing with the split. It was their constitution, their flag, their faith. They might betray nations, navies and each other, but not the shares. So let's say everything goes smoothly. You loot a fat merchantman, take her cargo, ransom her captain, and make it back to port without sinking, mutinying, or getting hit by a hurricane made entirely of flying casks. It's time for the final split, and it's not just about gold anymore, it's about memory, because this last moment, this final accounting of the voyage, will determine whether you leave as comrades or as enemies counting each other's fingers in taverns. The ship anchors in a safe harbour, a hidden cove, or maybe a pirate-friendly port, or one of those places where local government is just a man named Benito with a large knife and a casual relationship with bribes. The crew assembles on deck. Everyone's got their eyes on the quartermaster. He opens the chest, counts out coins, jewels, pieces of 8, silver bars, bolts of silk, random religious artifacts, and yes, even that ruby-handled dagger. Then, out come the ledgers. And yes, pirate ships kept ledgers. Not always neat, not always spelled correctly, but functional. Gunner Billy, 1 share, lost tow plus 20 bonus. Davis, broke mast during storm, minus 10 penalty. Also probably lied about monkey theft. Adjustments were made based on injuries, conduct, and, let's say, behavioural surcharges. Pirate articles often included fines for fighting aboard ship, stealing from fellow crew, sleeping on watch, bringing cursed idols into shared quarters, throwing useful maps overboard to feel powerful. The quartermaster and 1 or 2 trusted men, often chosen by vote, would handle the payout. Each crewman stepped forward, received his share, and often did the exact same thing, bit the coin, nodded once, and vanished to go drink away his liver. But what if someone was unhappy with their cut? The beauty of pirate society was that you had no one else to blame. You signed the articles, you agreed to the system. If you didn't like it now, you either kept quiet or challenged the quartermaster, which meant a full audit in front of the crew, a process so exhausting that most preferred to grumble into their cups. Occasionally disputes escalated. In one known case, 2 pirates duelling over a disputed share tripped, fell overboard, and were eaten by sharks. The ship log reportedly noted this as problem resolved. But often fairness prevailed, because it wasn't just about this haul, it was about the next one. If a ship got a reputation for bad splits, it wouldn't attract good crew. Pirates had options. They jumped ships like modern freelancers switching jobs. Reputation was currency, and a captain who didn't divide fairly might soon find himself promoted to captain of the rowboat. Now let's zoom out. This system, chaotic, informal, sometimes decided by shouting, worked. Better than many royal navies, because it was simple, transparent, agreed upon. It had rules. It had enforcement. It had buy-in. It was, in short, a floating democracy run on stolen silver and mutual distrust, and it lasted. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, pirate crews from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean used similar systems. Different articles, different fines, different shares, but the core idea was the same. Don't cheat the crew, or you'll be voting from inside a cannon. And yes, some pirates got greedy, some lied, some stashed treasure and faked their deaths. But those weren't the norm. They were the cautionary tales, because every pirate knew the real danger wasn't the navy, or storms, or even rival crews. The real danger was division, not of treasure, of trust. And so they wrote it down, stamped it in rum-soaked ink, thumbprinted their allegiance to fairness, or at least a mutually agreed definition of it. Because when you live by the sword, you don't just want gold, you want a guarantee that your missing toe gets you 600 pieces of 8, that your quartermaster doesn't skim, that your captain doesn't sail off with the loot, and a Spanish mistress. You want a system, a spreadsheet, a handshake and a threat. And that's what Pirate Treasure Division really was. Not chaos, but contract. So the next time you hear, "No honour among thieves," remember this. Pirates didn't need honour, they had math.